one of the biggest challenges that I see from the young companies is that people have a great idea, but they don't really have a great idea what the market is for the idea. And they haven't spent enough time figuring out, is there a market for this product, and what's the competitive landscape? I mean, for example, a lot of companies come in with ideas for launch solutions, and it's a very competitive market, as you know, and prices have been driven down tremendously. And to me, it's really a saturated market. It's really going to be hard for a small company now to break into the launch market at this moment. You know, I think that's what happens. They don't really see what's happening in the marketplace and see that that opportunity is really saturated at this point.
Time for another episode of the Cold Star Project. I am Jason Kanigan, the host and the founder of Cold Star Technologies. We are on a mission to make space boring, and in order to do that, I am bringing you loads and loads of people from the space field who know a lot more than I do. Today we've got Michael Lyon, who I picked out because he's got this really neat background. He's an attorney, been general counsel for all kinds of organizations, including James Cameron's deep sea ventures. It's going down into the depths of the ocean there, checking out the Bismark and Titanic and that kind of thing. So we'll have a bit of a chat about that. And also, he was an adjunct professor at George Mason University, is involved with an incubator that's got a lot of activity that's going on. And so you're into a lot of things, Michael. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So you have done some of the first space tourist things here. You helped put together the first space tourist flights on Soyuz. These flights were led by Space Adventures. And as far as I understand, they're still the only space tourism flights. So tell us a little bit about that. Why is that important? And what's in the way of further space tourism?
Well, yeah, I was general counsel and vice president of Space Ventures when we put together the flights of Dennis Tito and then Mark Shuttleworth, the first person from Africa to go to space. And it was a really exciting time. A lot of people said it couldn't get done. We had mixed support at NASA. Some people at NASA supported it and some of the senior people didn't. So we had a battle that way. But the Russians were very supportive of us at that time. They needed the revenue, frankly, because they needed to get Soyuz up there every 6 months. So we helped fund the cost of their obligation to the ISS. Worked on television shows, different things. And I think that those flights were one of the catalyst forces in the new space sector, really. If you think about when that all launched, it's really around that time. Even Elon Musk came to our offices during that time when he had this crazy idea about building a rocket company. So it was a catalyst, and we still are actually, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, the only space tourism that's taken place is through Space Adventures on the Soyuz. A lot of exciting things. People are talking about Virgin and Blue Origin and SpaceX and different people, and I'm sure that's going to happen. I wonder how broad that market is. At the price points people are talking about, there are certainly hundreds or even thousands of people that will do it. But to get to be a really mass market, I think the prices are going to have to go down, significantly below what people are talking about now. So I think that price is one of the big significant impediments right now, and I think that perception of risk is also an impediment until that gets worked through the system.
Right. Well, there is a 6% launch vehicle failure rate that's kind of been hanging around for a long time. So, yeah. So after Space Adventures, you worked for Deep Ocean Expeditions, which was founded, as you say in the notes here, by the chairman of Space Adventures. So you're acting as general counsel for this company, and it's sending submarines down to hydrothermal vents and these ships and that. Tell us a little bit about that experience. And you personally went down to a hydrothermal vent 8,600 feet below the surface. And I imagine, it takes hours to get in and it takes hours to get out. And so tell us about it.
Yeah, so the company was founded by Mike McDowell, who's really a fantastic explorer. And what happened is the Russians built these two mirror submersibles that can go down to 20,000 feet. And they came online just as the Soviet Union fell apart and they didn't have funding. So we created kind of a symbiotic relationship with them where we helped fund their expeditions by bringing tourists along and by doing different media events. So we went down to Titanic. We went down, like if you've seen the movie Titanic by James Cameron, those are the mirror submersibles that are in that film. And the ship that they're on is the Keldysh, which is the support ship that I spent 3 weeks on myself. And we went down to the Bismarck with National Geographic with some of the survivors of Bismarck. And we did the hydrothermal vents, which actually got to go on that 3-week expedition where we went out to 9 North about 500 miles off the coast of Mexico. And I went on one of the dives, which is 12 hours. You sink down to the bottom of the ocean, and we turned on the lights, and there was this huge white octopus in front of us. So it was really exciting. I think going down to the deep oceans in some ways is the opposite of space. I mean, getting up to space and coming down from space are really hard and dangerous. Activities in space is relatively benign. Deep ocean is kind of the difference. I mean, it's easy to sink and hopefully easy to come back up, but down in the deep ocean where we were was 250 atmospheres. So it's, you get one pinprick on the side of the titanium hull, and, it's pretty problematic. So, but it was one of the great things I did. I did that in 2003. It was part of this film that, as you mentioned, James Cameron did, called Aliens of the Deep. Was looking at these extremophiles, kind of life that we might find in Saturn, Titan, or someplace like that. Life without photosynthesis based on chemosynthesis. So, still that extreme life is, I think, one of the most exciting things on the planet, and as close as you can get in some ways to going to another planet on Earth.
Right.
So,
yeah, that octopus was living down there under all those atmospheres. That's wild.
There's a lot of life, and they were almost all white because color didn't really matter in the deep. Once you were down about 300 feet, it was pretty dark. But except for the tube worms, those red tube worms, they were really, pretty vivid.
Okay. Another thing you've done, you've worked with a lot of businesses here. You're a co-founder of something called Xtronaut Enterprises, and tell us about that, because you've got a connection there to NASA's OSIRIS-REx mission, which is a neat thing. I had another guest talk about that as well. It was Jim Cantrell.
Yeah. So about 5 years ago, I met Dante Loretta, who's the principal investigator of OSIRIS-REx. And it's $1 billion NASA mission going to an asteroid. It's an asteroid right now. Next summer, we'll go down and collect a sample from that asteroid Bennu and bring the sample back to Earth in 2023. It's $1 billion mission, as I mentioned, but NASA cut all the education funding out of it, unfortunately. And both Dante and I think that one of the most important reasons we go to space is to inspire the next generation. I'm a believer that Silicon Valley is really a direct spin-off of the Apollo missions, because of all the generations of people that were inspired, people like you and me, really, from those missions that decided to do things in space. And so we thought, well, we need to do something about it. So we created basically a new space company in the space education and entertainment area called Xtronaut. We have 3 award-winning games out now that we work with the Boys and Girls Clubs. We work with NASA to use these, and teachers use them, families use them, and they're board games, but they're all based on real science. One's called Constellation, the game of night gazing, stargazing, and it's where you collect the different stars that comprise a constellation. You play the board with the different constellations. We have another game called Xtronaut, the game of solar system exploration, which is about collecting enough delta V from different rocket systems and gravity assist and boosters, and complete 30 real missions. And we won Good Housekeeping board game with that. We won Mensa Select, which is basically a top board game award for Constellation. And we have a new game called Don Link, which is you're really running a whole space mission. And now we're also working to take the expertise that we have running major space missions and in new space to launch low-cost science missions in the solar system. It's taking what people are doing in orbit, like you talk about CubeSats and such, and taking those kind of economics and doing solar system missions that are between $10 and $30 million instead of $1 billion. So it's a pretty exciting area in science, especially at missions between Venus and the asteroid belt. So that's what we're doing, and we're doing this now globally as well with Xtronaut.
Okay.
And the idea, by the way, the name Xtronaut we got because of all the people who are part of space exploration. Who's the astronaut in most exploration today? We really don't have one except on the ISS, let's say. But all these people, but these robotic missions that we send all over the solar system really are, of course, exploration. And the people who design them, operate them, analyze the data are extenders, are explorers on the extended basis. And there was really no term in the lexicon for those people, so we coined the name Xtronaut. Anyway,
where can people buy these games?
Amazon really is really we do Kickstarters every year for those for new games. We're having a new game coming out in March, and another one in April actually. So we have a lot coming down, and then we have a new fish game coming out, fish stock called Pisces. So we have probably 3 games coming out this year, all launched on Kickstarters, and then we sell them on Amazon, and then we sell them directly to school systems around the world.
Okay. Michael, are you involved in the development of the mechanics of these games, or is that handled by somebody else?
Yeah, it's a good question. Dante has always been a great gamer, so he develops the games. I'm more the business person, so
Yeah.
I manage the whole business process. But I guess the main part I do is the instructions.
Okay.
It's hard when you're deeply involved in something to write it up in a way that you assume it's natural. You assume that this makes sense, kind of the way you said it, and you might leave a few steps off. So that's probably my biggest role, is to be somebody who wasn't developing the game directly to draft the instructions in a way that everybody can really understand how the game works.
Okay, very valuable because as you say, the guy who came up with the mechanics knows all the ins and outs. And isn't this obvious? Yeah. Well, no. Now we've got to distill this down and explain it to somebody else in a way that
exactly.
So that's a valuable tool. I've seen a pattern here in your behavior, Michael, where you see somebody's developed a capability and it's underutilized, and then you come in and you plug them into a money-making venture with it. So that's really cool. So you're a mentor of a tech accelerator. It has a fun name, Creative Destruction Lab. Tell us about that and what your experience with it has been. I'm interested in a success story or a failure story. Take some time here and let us know what that's been like.
Well, so Creative Destruction Lab was launched out of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. It's generally Canadian based. There's 6 locations, including actually Oxford this year, and about 350 startup companies and developing companies go through the program every year. And there's different, what we call streams, which are subject matters. So there's everything from AI, which is actually very strong, blockchain, quantum, things related to quantum, cities, energy, and then one of them is space, and that's where I'm directly involved in, and that's based in Toronto. We have about 5 astronauts part of it, that former head of the Canadian Space Agency. Chris Hadfield, a very well-known Canadian astronaut, basically launched the program. We have Anusha Ansari from the X Prize. She's part of it. So it's really a great program. We meet every 8 weeks with companies. It's kind of like a business school class where you meet with companies, you talk about their strategy, their finance model, their marketing model, their HR model, everything beyond just the idea. I mean, a lot of these companies come in with just a great idea, but they don't really have all these other elements that you need to make a successful business. So we work on that with them, and then you pick 3 or 4 companies that you're going to work with over the 8 weeks between the next session and the one that just finished, and you talk to them and help them with progress, and so it's been a great experience.
Okay. So we touched on this, but I want to dig into this a little more. So you've got these space and AI startup founders coming in with, I want to change the world, right? This great idea. We see this so many times. And that, what do you wish that they would know or have in place before they started looking around for seed funding?
I think that, well, first of all, I would say that AI and space really go together well. I mean, a lot of what's happening in space is collecting a tremendous amount of data from the Earth. And one of I think the best things that AI can do is sort through data to find the most relevant data so that high-end human analysis can take place. So I think that they really do go hand in hand, AI and space. But, I think one of the biggest challenges I see from the young companies is that people have a great idea, but they don't really have a great idea what the market is for the idea. And they haven't spent enough time figuring out, is there a market for this product? And what's the competitive landscape? I mean, for example, a lot of companies come in with ideas for launch solutions. And it's a very competitive market, as you know, and prices have been driven down tremendously. And I'd say, to me, it's really a saturated market. I mean, it's really going to be hard for a small company now to break into the launch market at this moment. So I think that's what happens. They don't really see what's happening in the marketplace and see that opportunity is really saturated at this point. And I think that another problem that they have often is they spend a lot of time on the technology and not a lot of time on the marketing business strategy. A lot of them come out of the tech background, so they don't spend enough time thinking about how do we get to customers? How do we really secure revenue? And if you have a good idea, but you don't have the revenue, it's pretty hard to get investors, because investors like to see that this is something that's attractive to the marketplace. So I think that, I try and push or encourage companies to spend more time early on to validate that there's a market, even if it's just MOUs with various companies showing that they have an interest. If you can do this, we are interested conceptually. That's useful.
Hey, this is Jason Kanigan, the host of the Cold Star Project and the founder of Cold Star Technologies. I've decided to do something new. I've started doing daily update videos on who I met and what I learned the previous day in the space field. And it's a great sort of follow me thing. You can learn what I learn. I'm meeting a heck of a lot of people and learning a lot of things really fast. And the space field is really disparate. There are tons of nooks and crannies to go into and explore, from legal, operational, regulatory, compliance, and gosh, the end customer. Who'd have thought about that, right? So you can sign up for this. If you go to coldstartech.com/MSB, that's short for Make Space Boring, the mission we're on, then you can sign up, and in your email you will get a daily notification that the new video has been posted. I'm also thinking about doing some branded mini courses and summarizing papers as I'm able to. So those will be some goodies that are in there as well. So if you're interested in that, go to coldstartech.com/MSB and join us on the mission to make space boring. Now back to the interview. Okay. Have you signed NDAs with these folks where you're not able to share specific examples, or would you be willing to do that?
Well, I mean, I'll share one, which is.
You can not name it.
Well, it's okay. That's a good idea. So one of the companies I worked with was a German company that was doing a lunar lander, and they spent a lot of time on developing a lot of money. They actually raised a significant amount of money, put a lot of money into developing the specs for the lander, but not figuring out where the market was. For example, they didn't have a big presence in the United States. As you know, a lot of the funding for space, for better or worse, comes from the United States, from NASA. The CLIPS program for lunar missions, for example, is a major source. And it's pretty hard. It hasn't been proven that there's really private money to support this initial lunar economy yet. I haven't been convinced about that. I mean, there are private solutions that can support government missions there. Which is what NASA is doing, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But things that make sense on a private sector basis, standalone, where both the provider and the customer are private sector entities, it hasn't been proven yet. Hopefully that will happen. So I think that company ended up going bankrupt this summer, and it's back in the market now in a new kind of format. So I think they've learned some things from that, but it's hard to raise money, easy to burn through it. And I think you have to use it very strategically. And it didn't do, the problem I told you about, where I mentioned earlier about where they didn't really spend enough time figuring out where they were going to get the revenue from, and putting money chasing that, building capability to secure that was a problem.
Okay. Now, on the flip side of that, I do think that you believe it's an exciting time for startup companies in the commercial space sector. So how does that work?
I do. I think I think as you've seen launch costs driven down, you have been able to have lower cost vehicles being able to be launched that have have some risk in it, as you pointed out. And, there is risk, there is more failure. OSIRIS, I think the biggest difference between the missions today and, let's say, a NASA mission, OSIRIS-REx, is just the margin of error you're willing to accept. If you have a $180 million launch for a vehicle to go to an asteroid, you just don't want the thing to fail, So, so you have a lot of redundancy, a lot of testing, and all that is very expensive. When you have a lower cost paradigm, you're able to take bigger risks, and I think that's pretty exciting what we're able to do. Most of the money right now, I think, is really Earth-based observation. So that's it's collecting data from Earth in a cheaper way, whether it's tracking. One of the companies I worked with, tracking methane leaks, for example, making fertilizers applications more efficient. This was another company in CDL. There are these different markets that there were terrestrial based applications, but they just weren't as effective because we didn't have as much data, and they weren't as ubiquitous on the planet. So, that I think really creates some really exciting opportunities.
So is that where you're seeing investment going? I think
Yeah, I
you've
think
got
that
more
the
to say
biggest,
than I believed at the beginning on this.
well, I think the biggest investment really is Earth-based observation. That's where I think um, there's a handful of profitable, or hopefully profitable launch companies now. Then there's companies making the spacecraft, and there's a handful of those. Then there's companies that make those spacecraft operate more efficiently. There's some, propulsion systems that are pretty innovative coming out. There's some control systems that allow people to control the spacecraft better. Then there's the data that comes out of the spacecraft, and there's some companies that are making that access to data more efficient, like Skywatch. That's another company in CDL. That's a great company. And then there's a bunch of companies that are really using all those platforms to gather data that can be used by different commercial sectors on Earth. And I think that's where you see the strongest economics right now, are those companies that are doing that. And whether it's a company tracking shipping, a company, like I said, methane gas, crops, where buildings are taking place. Obviously, there's civilian and there's military applications of these applications. So I feel like that's where the insurance sector, is another revenue source for this kind of business. So I'm seeing that's where the most customer money is going, and I think in some ways the most exciting startups are.
Okay. Let me ask you to put your attorney hat on for the moment and ask you, do you see startups consistently missing something important about legally protecting themselves, or are they generally doing a good job of this?
No, they miss it all the time. I work
Okay.
with a lot of startups, which is an area I like working in because I have a business and legal background, so it helps. But it's hard because money's tight, so they do things themselves. They draft collaborative agreements themselves, which sometimes they go and they regret later. They haven't really thought through the risks of what they're doing, even NDAs. But especially collaborative agreements, and then fundraising. They might have not had that sophisticated counsel for early fundraising, and they end up giving more rights away, not just valuations, but rights away than they needed to. And IP protection, of course, is another area, which can be extremely complicated and expensive. So you really have to get the best bang for your buck, because you can spend huge amounts of money on IP protection. And where do you get the most value? And what should you really do in that strategy? And then just corporate governance. How do you organize your boards? What kind of meetings do you have? Are you in compliance? And then export is another area that I work in, that which is a very complicated area from the United States perspective. Export compliance. You don't want to make a mistake of it. There's been some companies that made mistakes and paid the price for it. And it's not just that gets you in trouble. It can actually interfere with your business model going down the road, because certain clients, like certain government clients, aren't going to work with you if you have that problem. So yeah, there's a lot of need, and usually low budgets, and it's usually one of the last things people think about.
Right. Okay, Michael Lyon. This will lead into the next question then, which is, when should people in that space field be ready to work with you? When should they be thinking about, oh, I should go talk to Michael?
Right away. I mean, I think really early in the process, actually. The earlier the better, because it's always easier to stay out of trouble than get out of trouble once you're in it. So, I mean, as soon as you have even a little bit of funding, and I work with companies with just 10 hours a month kind of thing or less, but just give them, I think, the best value of advice at where they are. I think it's really important. So, I mean, I have some companies that don't have any revenue. I try and help with a little, just as they're going forward. But I think it's one of the first things you need to look at, because you're building your whole value chain going forward, and you need to protect that. So you don't want to give away things you don't have to give away.
Right. And for those who are novices to things like seed round or venture capital funding, you can get into situations where you're overly enthusiastic, as founders, including me, always are, and get into a situation where you signed on to achieve certain revenue targets over a period of time. And if you don't achieve them, there's ratcheting equity clauses that you lose equity in your own company to the funders,
Right.
and you can lose your company that way. And this is not
Absolutely.
uncommon. This is not
Nope.
uncommon.
You're
and
right.
protecting intellectual property, as you say. Keeping that out of the hands of folks who maybe are your friends today, but might not necessarily be your friends tomorrow. So, and I think too, one thing that I've seen is everybody's all buddy-buddy when they start a business. And so say you've got 2 or 3 founders, how do you separate those?
That's right. When you're starting a company with people, it's like getting married.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get married to somebody, it's not very romantic to think about the divorce at the same moment. But some people do a prenuptial.
Yeah.
But I always think that, when you're doing an investor agreement or your partnership agreement with your partner initially, it should be like a marriage and a prenuptial packaged together in a way.
Mm-hmm.
You really need to think through not only how you're going to work together and who's going to do what, and avoid free rider problems, which I think is often a really big issue, where somebody's just doing a lot more work than the other, and you start to think it's not really fair. The deal's not really fair. But then how do you unravel the situation? I do business divorces, one of the things I do in legal practice. And, I think it's the more you can think about that ahead of time. So you think about how you unravel this. If it doesn't go well, the better. So it's worth taking time to think about that up front. So when you ask your question about when you get a lawyer involved, that's why I say very early, because even when you guys are just thinking about forming a company together, it's pretty important to think about who's doing what are the responsibilities, how are you going to share revenue, how are you going to share expenses, what are you going to do if it doesn't work out? All those things should be thought of upfront if you can.
Right. And yes, and it's not negative. It's not. I've been through this. I co-founded a business with a friend, and we're still friends because we had the good agreement at the start of how are we going to separate this thing. But man, joint bank accounts and signing authority, and you're logged into all these apps together and that kind of thing, right? You have to extract yourself from that when you're ready to leave, and it's just not that easy. So, Michael, how can people get?
You're right. You're right. I'll make one more point about that, which is that one of the most valuable things about doing the agreement is kind of what you just said, which is that it makes you think through the issues, and then it makes sure that by writing it down and codifying it, that you're on the same page. Because to me, one of my favorite words in business is problem, because I think that means opportunity. But my least favorite word is assumption. And that just permeates business assumption. And it often is in the relationship when you go in, that you're assuming the other person's on the same page with you about everything. And almost 100% you're going to find places that assumption was wrong. And that's not a bad thing at all. That's a good thing, because then you work it through, and you eliminate the assumption, and you get down on firm's position for going forward. I think it's a really healthy process. So anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's great. It's great for legal operating agreements. It's great for project management. It's great for sales, coming up with those assumptions and smoking them out, and then straightening them out. Causes a lot of friction to just go away. So, Michael, how can people get a hold of you? Where should they go to find out more?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn at Michael Lyon, and Lyon Capital Group is my parent company. I have. You can reach me at mlyon, MLYON, at lyonlegalgroup.com. Always happy to hear from you and brainstorm about ideas and talk about what's going on with you.
All right, Michael, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for the interview.